The power of story is everywhere. Everything is a story. See, we used to be better at telling our stories. We've lost something. We're going to have to find it again. It's almost too quiet out here. Everything tells a story. Sound, where sounds are positioned, camera angles. Now, I'm just telling you all this to think about how you perceive the world. It's pretty quiet right now here in the city. We got lazy. We allowed Hollywood to be our storytellers, and we forgot to tell stories ourselves. Real ones. We started adopting other people's stories because we thought that would make it acceptable, make our lives acceptable. And when we did that, we actually eventually just stopped telling any real stories whatsoever, anything of real depth. Social media had huge power to be a storyteller, still does. The problem is that everything has been co-opted by false stories, how people want to be perceived instead of how they are. Now, there's plenty of storytellers out there, and there's plenty of storytellers even on social media. But what I'm trying to tell you is that what we're missing is the story that we actually live every day that's all around us. Everything here tells a story. Where I'm sitting, the city I'm in, the street I'm on, the building I'm at, it all has a history. It all tells a story. A story of people that have come before, the people that are presently here, and a story about where the future could be and where it could go. Now, I'm telling you these things because there's a whole point to all of this in terms of how I think we can recover the power of narrative, the power of story, in a way that re-inspires people. And there are a lot of different ways to do that. But I've got a couple of things in particular in mind. I posted something earlier today that I think was interesting that I found about, I think it was down in Charlotte, North Carolina, where they did a memorial to people who had basically been, buried in a potter's field. And they projected on a tree what a face, right? And that face was there as a memorial, and it came alive as the tree itself was, in a sense, kissed by the breezes. Very, very cool way of doing things. A cool way of taking something that's in nature, something that is right there, and using it as a canvas, right? Well, everything around us has a story. And there are so many ways to use similar kinds of approaches to tell those stories in interesting ways that also instruct, educate, but also inspire. And that's kind of what I want you to think about. Where I'm at right now, well, the city of Richmond is filled with all kinds of stories. It is alive with history, even though many people have tried to hide that history, erase that history, ignore, deny, or pretend like it didn't happen. But all of our stories, all of our history, individually and collectively, is important. And it's important that we allow those stories to be told. There's a lot to be gleaned from it. Not every story is going to be a story of your liking. Doesn't mean you can't learn something from it. It's important to learn from our history. It's important to learn from the good, the bad, the beautiful, the ugly. All of these things make up the palette of life here in the temporal. And of course, being temporal, it has a definitive beginning and a definitive end, just like our own temporal bodies, our mortal coils, has a definitive beginning and definitive end. But just because each of us are books and these stories here end, it doesn't mean that there's not a bigger story that you may be able to play a role in, not only here, but in forever after. After all, why do you think we memorialize people that have passed on, have died? We talk about the stories of their lives. We remember those stories in our memories. All of that points to a greater story, a bigger story, a story that doesn't end here. Now, let me show you something. Talk about story. So where I'm at has a big story. You see this? You see, it's a Churchill tunnel. About 200 feet east of here is the western portal of the Churchill Tunnel. On 11th of December, 1873, the Chesapeake and Ohio Locomotive Number 2 passed through the tunnel, marking the completion of one of the longest tunnels in the United States. The tunnel was being repaired on the 2nd of October, 1925, when the Chesapeake and Ohio Locomotive Number 231 entered the tunnel heading west, pulling 10 flat cars. The train was near the western portal when suddenly 190 feet of the tunnel collapsed, trapping and killing railroad workers, some of whom remain entombed in this tunnel along with the train. See? There's stories everywhere. If you erased every story that was a tragedy, that was sad, that was unsavory, that didn't meet your expectations for everything being positive and hopeful, well, you know what you would have to do? You'd have to erase the entire world, including yourself. Now, why would I say that? Because this world is filled with tragedy, sadness, but also hope. And stories that people have overcome great hardships and great tragedies and great sorrows. You see, if you start erasing history, you're essentially erasing part of you and what made you you. So, a culture that erases its story is not a nation that's going to write a very good one in the future, unless it changes its predicament. You can always change that. We need to tell everybody's stories. When you start erasing people's stories, and you start erasing the history of this country, that's exactly what you're doing, because nations are made of people. Some of those people have done great things. Some of those people have done really terrible things. But it's still part of the overall story. That's why I want you to stop editing history here. We're going to put everything back the way it was. And we're going to start telling a different story by showing what we can overcome and also what we have overcome. Now, if you don't like that, well, you can leave this country and go write a story somewhere else. But everybody's stories, good, bad, beautiful, or ugly, make up the totality of the book of books that is a nation state. And everybody's histories are important, whether you like that or not. And whether you like it or not, you're part of their story, and they're part of yours. You see, if you start erasing everything here will be erased, including you, and your own history. Instead of people being able to learn from it, being inspired from what you've overcome and what you can overcome. And I don't want to see that happen. Now, there's a reason why I use the word overcome, because not far away, over that direction, is where I wanted to memorialize what we had overcome and were overcoming still in our country, and how we overcame slavery as a nation. But instead of doing that, instead of focusing on telling that story, you were conned into erasing that story a little bit more by trying to erase somebody else's, which is the story of the statuary that you removed here. You see, you were diverted while you were being led into erasing the history that you overcame. You were taking away from your own story, while I was trying to get you to actually focus on what you have overcome and making a new story by showing that. Do you understand what I'm telling you? When you erase other people's stories, you erase a little bit of yourself. And in that case, you erased a huge opportunity to do something that would inspire, encourage, educate everybody by talking about and building something that memorializes and living history and tells the story of what you've overcome and what we have overcome. That was a huge loss, all because you were diverted to erase part of your own story, part of what you've overcome, instead of focusing on telling that story of overcoming. That's unwise. It's foolish even. And in a sense, it's a tragic chapter in the history of the entire country. Oh, I'm not talking about the history that you wanted to hide and erase. That was tragic itself. But by trying to erase part of that history, you erased part of yours. That's what I mean by you work against your own best interests. And when you're ready to change that, we can recover what you tried to throw away and do something greater together. Think about it. So you've heard it said, love your neighbor as you love yourself. So if you do harm, you hate your neighbor. You do evil to your neighbor, you're actually harming yourself. Just like erasing other people's stories that you don't like is, in a sense, erasing part of yours. And I want you to think about that. I want you to think about crime. Harming others, plundering them, stealing from them, poisoning them, abusing them, killing them. What does that say about you? What are you telling everybody about your story? Well, as it is for people, so too it is for nations. So if people want to erase one another out of their lives, what do you think war is? Huh? What do you think any destructive thing is? And I mean truly destructive, not just something you think is destructive, something that actually is destructive. I mean, do we not have war stories? Are they not tragedies, but also inspiring? Yet war itself as a story in humanity is one of people trying to write other nations and other peoples, tribes, tongues, and nations out of existence. So if you love your neighbor as you love yourself, and you treat your neighbor as if they don't matter, as if they should be used, abused, plundered, taken advantage of, and even destroyed, what does that say about your story? And what does that say about nations that do the same thing? After all, nations are made of people. Nations are a book of books. Anything that makes you afraid, fearful, truly fearful, for the right reasons. How could you write a story of courage if you don't have fear to overcome? How could you write an inspiring story of love, a love story, if you don't have indifference and hatred to overcome? And how could you write a humble love story, a story of overcoming and coming to understand things that you didn't know, and realizing that you need to be forgiven for things that you did wrong, and forgive yourself and others? Unless you made mistakes, and others made mistakes that needed to be forgiven. How could you overcome without that opportunity? I'm not saying those things are right. I'm saying that you can overcome those things. It's part of who you are. It's part of your story. Unless you write yourself out of it by writing others out of yours. All of history is a story. Every person to have lived, breathed, right, existed here is a storybook. And collectively, it's a giant story of stories. That's what history is. No one said this world was going to be perfect. This world is here to teach you something, to point you to something bigger, a bigger story. A story that none of us can truly fathom. We can get glimpses of here, in moments of happiness and joy, hope, inspiration, creativity, and even in overcoming very difficult times. That's why we were always told, in this world there will be trials and tribulations, but do not lose heart, for Christ has overcome. You can overcome too. And as a nation, we can collectively together overcome our challenges. And what is a nation? A nation is a book of books. And everybody, you and me included, are books. Everybody plays a role. Everybody can play a role. Everybody is playing a role, whether they realize it or not. I think it's time that we start writing a more inspiring story, because we have a lot to overcome, individually and collectively. But you see, those are the greatest kinds of stories. When it seems impossible, like there's no way out, the darkness is too thick. They're the greatest stories because they're the most inspiring stories. They're humbling stories. But they're also stories that we all can connect with, because we all face trials and tribulations. We all face tough times. We all face crisis. That's all part of our individual and collective stories. That's why I've been talking so much about this and talking so much about America Next. In a sense, I step out of my story with you, and I observe it from a third-person point of view to do these talks like this. But I'm still in my own story, and you are in mine, and I am in yours. Don't you think we can write a greater story than what we've been writing, individually and collectively? I do. And I know we will. The only question is are we going to continue doing the things individually and collectively as a people that cause us to write one another off and out of our own stories and the greater story of the nation and the greatest story that is beyond all of human history? Do you know what a cemetery is? In a sense, a cemetery, a graveyard, is a library. It's a book of books. Each person that left this world left their temporal, mortal coils behind. That was the end of their individual stories here, and the beginning of a new story. But you walk around a cemetery and you can feel the stories. So maybe I'll take you on a field trip to a very famous cemetery here and tell you some more stories. After all, it's part of your story already. it's part of history. Just like where I live is part of history. These buildings were here all the way back to the time when Abraham Lincoln walked these streets. Just days before he was assassinated. But he was an amazing story. He was an inspiring story. He's part of your story and mine. Just like the men that died in this tunnel back here in 1925 all have stories. Collectively, they became a very tragic story. But that story is still being told. They're not forgotten. Long after they entered into a completely different storyline. That tunnel was here during the Civil War. Should we erase that too? Should we erase these buildings that were here, where they used slaves to move ice and perishable produce? Because if you're going to do that, you should understand how many people that live here. Well, there are Americans that have that heritage. They're black Americans that have that heritage, and they have overcome and are overcoming, along with all kinds of other folks that are here living with them. Are you going to erase their collective stories as well? Because every story that you erase here equates to how much of your own that you're erasing. And it tells a lot about the kind of story that you've been writing and why. It's actually telling the real story. That's why I keep telling you can't hide anything here. Think about it. Consider what I'm telling you. So I'm going to tell you a lot of stories. I'm going to tell you more about my own. And then we're going to enter into a collective story as I tell you stories, as I take you around and introduce you to part of your own history, which is part of your own story. As it is for people, so too it is for the nation. So I told you everything here has a story. The restaurant behind me, the owners, the people that work there, the people that frequent the cafe, the people that live in these buildings. Everything's interconnected. Everybody's stories are connected. We all play a role in one another's stories. So right over here is our local market. I'll tell you a little bit about some of that story. this market right here. I love those people from India. Lady who was in there, she's not there anymore, but she used to be there at night. Lost 2 of her brothers during COVID. She treated me like a son every time I'd go in there. And I'm incredibly grateful. I know her story. I'll tell you a little bit more about the story. That place has been robbed on a regular basis by people writing very bad stories in this neighborhood over and over and over again. And unfortunately, because leaders would not support the police, they wrote a bad story too and enabled more of it. So people go in there and rob the place all the time. Everything is connected. See that truck down there? I'll tell you a little bit about that story. If you look across the street, that's a warehouse. They deliver food. Their stories are so important that if they didn't get up and write part of their story every day at work and do the jobs that a lot of folks won't do, well, a lot of people's stories would have ended already. You see, their story and the truckers, right, and the people that work in that warehouse are writing a very important story for everybody, even though most people never stop to think about how important their story is. But without their story and all the stories that make up that industry, well, everybody's stories would be a lot more difficult and there'd be a lot fewer stories left. You see, everybody is in a book of books. Now, if I continue to walk, I could tell you story after story after story. We look at all these cars. All these cars have people that are books, that have stories. The people that designed and built those cars all have stories. You see, everybody's stories are interlocking. And when we don't appreciate them, or we try to write them out or write them off, or pretend like they don't matter, well, we're doing damage to our own story. Starting to see my point? Across the street and across the highway, if you look at those buildings way back there, the colorful lights on them, that's VCU Medical Center, the only level 1 trauma center in the area. There are all kinds of stories being written at any given point in time, and many of them are sad stories, and many of them are not. But they've been through a lot too. But without their stories and the people that go in every day to write those stories, well, there again, we would have a lot fewer storybooks and stories continuing to be written. If you look behind me, down the street, you'll see a gas station. You know what the story is with that gas station? About every week or so, there are gunshots, and people are writing themselves out of their own stories and everybody else's, because they have no value in themselves or the stories of others. Now, those are tragic stories. There are many tragic stories in this area, in this neighborhood. But there's also, for every tragic story, there are amazing, inspiring stories of people that overcome every single day. And those are hero stories. So, you see what I mean? And why it is I'm telling you these things. Because I'm telling you part of a story that you're a part of. And I'm telling you stories in your story that you're not aware of, and why it's important to know. Remember what I said earlier? Love one another. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Now that's a pretty amazing story, don't you think? You see, it's a much more complicated storyline than you might have thought. But your part of that story is huge. It's extremely important to everybody else's stories, because only you can write it. Only you can be a part of adding to the collective story in a way that changes all of our stories. We are a book of books. And everybody's story is important. If we all lived that way, we'd all treat one another much differently. We'd have much more respect for one another and one another's stories. And we'd take the time to get to know them a lot better. Because, well, it's part of our story. So, think about it. I'm going to keep doing these. I'm going to keep telling you all kinds of stories. I'm going to connect more and more dots for you so that you can start doing the same and think about what it is your story is contributing to the stories of others. I think you can write a great story. Well, think about this. Think about Facebook. Facebook. Well, if you judge things only at face value, you're likely to be deceived. Because that's judging things only on how they appear. And you know that Jesus said that in this world, most people judge things in this world by external appearances. Isn't that judging a book by the cover? So if you're judging a book by the cover, you're not actually getting to know what's in between the book covers and what the real story is. And unfortunately, that's how most people choose to live here. But the book covers are just book covers. It's not the whole book. So when you ignore the whole book, or you judge people and you hate people just on the book covers alone, what are you actually saying about yourself? What are you actually doing? Huh? What are you actually revealing about your own story? Starting to see my point now, huh? So let's circle back around to war. War stories have captivated people for a very long time. And if people try to write one another out of history, out of their stories, what do you think happens when nation states try to do it? Well, most of the kingdoms, empires, nations, and peoples to have actually existed in history, you don't know about. And in many cases, it was because they were erased from it by their own choices, their own decisions, their own actions. And many times, there are those who chose to erase others because they had to be. So when you think about why that is, and you think about the fact that you don't know anything about them, and you think about why it is that some people write themselves out of their own stories by trying to erase others out. Well, those that try to erase people out of stories, and they are a nation state, well, they pay deep consequences. And they are truly tragedies. They're tragic stories. They're stories that didn't have to be that way, but because they wouldn't listen, and they saw no value in others, and because they saw no value in the biggest story, which is why history exists, they had to be prevented from erasing other people's stories. And in many cases that took place in wars. Now, here we are, and everybody is seeing rumors and hearing rumors of wars, and there are wars going on. You were told it'd be that way. But why do you think it continues? Huh? It continues because people hate others. They want to erase them out of history. They want to erase them out of their own lives and out of the community of nations. So in doing that, or trying to do that, What are they actually saying about them? And what kind of story are they writing? And how long do you think that story is going to be? Same thing holds true when you deal with individuals that are intent on writing evil stories that threaten the stories of others and their nations. And it's also interesting that other nations, when they conquer another nation, always want to rewrite their story to suit their own tastes. And that's a corrupted story. It's also a work of fiction. Now, the best stories are real stories. The best stories are actual stories, not just works of fiction. The most inspiring stories are authentic and real stories. Just as people write stories, nations write stories. So what kind of stories are being written by nations right now? What kind of story is being written in Europe with Russia and Ukraine? What kind of stories are being written in the Middle East? Particularly with Iran and Israel. What kind of stories are being written on our own borders? In our own country, in our own states, in our own cities and neighborhoods and homes. You see, when people hate one another and they are intent upon doing evil and writing destructive stories, they write a tragedy and they write themselves out of the bigger history book. That's why we have stories of justice. It's also why we have war stories. It's why we have murder mysteries. Why we also have stories of courage, of hope, self-sacrifice. So when I bring up what is going on at the border and over the border with drug cartels and how their lust for money and human trafficking and arms, what kind of stories do you think they're all writing? Huh? And what kind of stories are going to have to be written to stop them from trying to take over the greater stories, the stories of nations, of peoples, of tribes, of families? So we have stories of law and order. We have stories of judgment. There are stories throughout all the history and all the cultures that are a type of literature known as apocalyptic literature. But all of them still fit within the meta story, the bigger story of human history, and the even larger story that transcends the temporal and the history that we write here. It's not separate from, it's a part of. In fact, it's the biggest part of. It's what allows all this to continue, despite how many bad stories are written. But everybody's lives, just like all the nations, are choose-your-own-adventure stories. And that means that you're responsible for the choices you make throughout the entirety of the story. And that means that if you make bad decisions, or you continue to make decisions that you know are harmful to you and others, and you refuse to change, you refuse help, you refuse to heed warnings, well, what kind of story do you think you're about to write? Gets pretty intense now, doesn't it? Why do you think there are trials and tribulations here? Why there's so much pain and suffering here? And why there's also amazing stories of overcoming all of it. You see, in the end, there's but two kinds of books. Books that lived only for the book covers, and books that lived for the greater story. And there's a reason why it's called his story. His story. In Christendom, we would call that the story of Yeshua, Jesus, and the story of God's people, and the story of humanity, and all of history. And in that last book in the Bible, the book of Revelation, also called the Apocalypse of John, it talks a lot about books at the very end, including the most important book. In fact, it is the greatest book of books ever written. And it's the Lamb's Book of Life. And I assure you, it's not like Facebook. It's so deep and so wide. And so interesting that it transcends anything anybody else has written. And why? Well, the why is because of you. It's a great love story that encompasses every type of literature and every type of book ever written. work together in a grand narrative to show you how much God loves you. And here's another thing about that book. It's absolutely and completely filled with true stories. True stories that not only lived here in this world and became part of the story of this world and the history of this world and your own stories. But stories that will come alive and are alive again because they're in the greatest story ever written. Don't write yourself out of history here or the book of books there. Think about it. And think about why it is I'm telling you this. I'll give you a hint. It's because I care and I love you. And I want us to write a much better story together. Give it some thought.